So, good evening to everybody. And today's topic for discussion is common childhood malignancies. So, I'm Dr. Puneet, and I'll be taking you through a couple of slides in the next 1 hour. Yes, so I'm just putting it to full screen. It's taking some time. Yes, okay. So this is the scope of our seminar. So even though our topic is common childhood malignancies, we're going to focus on 3 tumors today. One is leukemia, which is the commonest malignancy in children. The second group would be lymphomas. And thirdly, we'll also cover Wilms tumor in this. Although it is not one of the commonest malignancies in children, but because this seminar covers tumors, we try to put it within this topic itself so that we cover all important tumors in one go. So what is the incidence? Look at this graph. This is from the SEER program 2005 to 2009. This shows the incidence of childhood cancer in children between 0 to 14 years of age. Now focus on this part of the pie chart, which is blue in color. So it shows that leukemia occupies almost 30% of childhood cancers. Okay, so it's the commonest malignancy in children. Second most common are CNS tumors, but that's not the topic of our discussion. It in itself is a big topic. And the third portion is lymphomas. The third lymphoma. So we'll be discussing leukemias and lymphomas in childhood. So they're different from what is there in adulthood. We're going to discuss childhood leukemias and lymphomas. And then if you look at this, there are 4.7% of the tumors in children are renal tumors. And amongst these renal tumors, almost 90% are Wilms tumor. So we'll be covering Wilms tumor also in this topic. So first we go ahead with leukemia. What are the types of leukemia you know of? There are 4 common types that you should all know. The first is acute lymphoblastic leukemia. So that is commonly known as ALL. And it comprises almost 75 to 80% of all childhood cancers. Right? 75 to 80% of all childhood leukemias. Amongst these, there is BALL and TALL. BALL is almost 80 to 85%. So if someone asks you what is the commonest childhood cancer, it is leukemia. And within leukemia, it is BALL. Okay, so you should always know this. Then there are 3 other types. One is acute myeloid leukemia or AML, which comprises 15 to 20% of childhood leukemias. Then there is CML, that is chronic myeloid leukemia, which is around 3 to 4%. And then there's a separate entity known as JMML, that is juvenile myelomonocytic leukemia, which occurs in 1 to 2% of the children. So you need to know just the names of these last 2 tumors, but ALL and AML are important for you to know and differentiate. So what exactly is leukemia? So I'll just read you through the definition of leukemia and I'll explain in the next slide that we have. So acute lymphoblastic leukemias represent a clonal expansion. That means that the precursor cells which ultimately give rise to RBCs start reproducing at an unabated rate. Normally what happens is whenever there is a precursor cell, it eventually multiplies, but then after it has to mature into a cell so that it can function properly. What happens in leukemia is that they go reproduction, they multiply, clonal expansion occurs, but there is arrest in maturation. So they are useless cells, and what will happen? They will keep multiplying within the bone marrow, because bone marrow is the site of hematopoiesis. And what will happen is that these cells do not function properly. They're going to replace all the normal cells of the bone marrow. So in fact, when we discuss the clinical features, this is what happens in leukemias. Abnormal cells keep multiplying and they replace the normal cells of the bone marrow. So this is the picture where it shows that there is a hematopoietic stem cell. It ultimately multiplies and then differentiates into a lymphoid progenitor and a myeloid progenitor. Okay. The lymphoid progenitor ultimately gives rise to lymphocytes, which can be B lymphocytes and T lymphocytes. And the myeloid progenitor not only gives rise to your granulocytic lymphocytes, that is neutrophils, eosinophils, and basophils, but also gives rise to monocytes, platelets, and RBCs. So now, if this particular lymphoid progenitor undergoes a clonal expansion and does not undergo maturation, it is going to lead to ALL. Whereas if this myeloid progenitor starts having clonal expansion and does not mature into the respective cell lines, it gives rise to AML. Okay, so this is the pathogenesis. Now, in the next slide, I'll talk about the epidemiology. The peak incidence of ALL is within 2 to 5 years. When you talk of AML, there is no peak incidence in children, but when you talk of ALL, the peak incidence is 2 to 5 years. It is slightly commoner in boys and occurs in whites more than in blacks. What are the risk factors for ALL? So you should know that in most cases of leukemias, you will not identify any underlying risk factors. Less than 5% of the children with acute leukemias actually have an underlying identifiable risk factor. Okay, so what can be these risk factors? There is ionizing radiation. So it is of historical importance in the past when X-rays were done even in pregnancies, or even in today's date when pregnant women are exposed to X-rays not knowing that they're pregnant, it leads to in utero exposure to radiation. But more common source of radiation exposure is when a child who has already had some disease, and for that disease he has received radiotherapy. So that radiotherapy per se is a risk factor for ALL. Then other risk factors can be chemicals like benzenes and nitrosoureas. Even when we talk of these vehicular pollutants, they can also act as risk factors for ALL. Then there are certain genetic syndromes which are associated with increased risk of ALL. These include Down syndrome. There is a whole list, but I'm giving you a few common ones. So most important amongst these is Down syndrome. You have Li-Fraumeni syndrome, neurofibromatosis, and ataxia telangiectasia. So if you look at this picture, many of you may be able to identify, but this is a very typical facies where the child has a flattened face. He has a mongoloid slant of the eyes, flat nasal bridge, and this is very typical facies of a Down's child. Okay, so in Down's children, there is almost 20-fold increased risk of leukemia. So if you compare a normal child and a Down's child, that Down's child has 20-fold increased risk of developing a leukemia in his lifetime. And when we talk of Down syndrome ALL, if you compare it to a normal child having ALL versus a Down syndrome ALL, the Down syndrome ALL usually has a poorer prognosis than normal children. So we have discussed about the definition and pathogenesis of ALL. We've discussed about the risk factors which are present in identified in less than 5% of the children with ALL, and now we move on to classification. So what has happened till date is that most of your books till now follow the FAB classification of ALL. So you look at this comparative table. On the right side I've written FAB classification of ALL, on the left side is WHO classification of ALL. So previously we were using this French, American, British classification of ALL, which is now old, and it is less relevant in terms of treatment and prognosis. What was this FAB classification based on? It was based on the pathological appearance of the malignant cells. So this was previously used, and typically the ALL slides were classified as L1, L2, and L3. However, of late, WHO has come up with the latest classification of ALL, and it is far more relevant in terms of both the treatment and prognosis. Depending on why do you need to classify any disease? You classify a disease because you want to know that if it is this particular class of disease, then we give this particular treatment. Okay, so it helps in defining the treatment and explaining the prognosis of that particular class. So WHO came up with this classification of ALL where they said that it is better to classify acute lymphoblastic leukemia based on the underlying genetic abnormality in the malignant clone. So based on these genetic abnormalities that are identified in these malignant clones, the ALL children are classified into standard risk, intermediate risk, and high risk. And the treatment and prognosis for these three risk stratifications are different. So that is why it is important. So a very gross idea about how this classification is done, they say that if BALL is associated with certain recurrent genetic abnormalities, so there are 7 identified genetic abnormalities. If the child has any one of those 7 identified genetic abnormalities, it will be classified as BALL with recurrent genetic abnormalities. And if no genetic abnormality is identifiable in that particular child, then it is known as BALL, not otherwise specified. With TALL, they have not yet come up with any such classification. Now, this is the conventional FAB classification, which all of you know in the books, that L1, L2, L3 is present. And in L1, there are homogeneous small cells with high nuclear cytoplasmic ratio. In L2, there are large and small cells, both sizes present, and it is a more heterogeneous population. And in L3, which is known as mature ALL, there are homogeneous large cells with a lower NC ratio. So this you need to know for more like for examiners who might want to ask the older FAB classification. Otherwise, what is relevant in today's date is WHO classification. So what can be the clinical presentation of children with acute leukemias? There can be certain general symptoms. So general symptoms of fever, which is present in almost 60% of the children. Then lassitude, that means malaise, which can be present in almost 50% of the children. They can have anorexia and weight loss. Sometimes these are the only symptoms present in these leukemic children. A mother will come and tell you that my child has been having fever for the past 1.5 to 2 months, and he's feeling very weak, and he's not playing as usual, and he has had loss of appetite. So whenever this degree of duration of fever is present and there is no history, no other history present, after ruling out all common infections, somewhere in your mind this should also be kept as a differential. Okay. Now the second group of symptoms is due to bone marrow invasion. So as I told you, in pathogenesis, what happens is that the leukemic cells which originate in the bone marrow, they keep on multiplying, but they do not mature into functional cells. And eventually what will happen is that the normal bone marrow precursors and normal cells will start declining because the bone marrow is completely being replaced by the leukemic cells. So what will happen? The normal WBCs will decrease. What will this lead to? It will lead to increased risk of infections. In fact, you will see that these children can also have oral candidiasis. So oral candidiasis is not something you will find in immunocompetent children. Okay, oral candidiasis is not found in immunocompetent children. But if you find a child who has oral candidiasis, that can give you a clue that this child is having unusual infections and he must be immunocompromised. Then you have, so, and apart from this oral candidiasis I told, because I projected a picture, otherwise also they are at increased risk of all infections. So all commonly present infections will develop at a higher rate in these children. Then you have decreased hemoglobin. So HB, because RBC count has come, RBCs are decreased in number, so HB will also decrease. This will lead to progressive pallor, almost present in 40%. And then you have decreased platelet count. So what will platelet reduction lead to? It will lead to increased risk of bleeding. So often it is seen as petechia in the skin. So look at this picture that I'm projecting. Over here you can see these petechial rash over the shin of the tibia in this particular patient. Apart from that, bleeding can occur from any site, including epistaxis from the nose, hematuria, or melena. So dark colored stools can be present. Then the third set of manifestations is due to lymphoid system infiltration. So lymphoid system consists of the liver, spleen, and the lymph nodes of the body. Okay. So because these leukemic cells will ultimately be released from the bone marrow, go into the blood, and they'll form a niche in all the lymphoreticular organs. So there will be lymphadenopathy, there will be splenomegaly, and there will be hepatomegaly. So in this picture, you can see that this child has huge cervical lymph nodes. Okay, so this is lymphadenopathy. Then the fourth set of symptoms is due to extramedullary involvement. So once the first set of symptoms is general, which is fever, lassitude. The second set of symptoms is due to bone marrow infiltration. So the normal HB, platelet, and TLC will come down. The third set of symptoms is due to lymphoid system infiltration. So liver lymphadenopathy, splenomegaly, hepatomegaly. And the fourth set of symptoms is due to extramedullary involvement. So these cancer cells, once they've spilled into the blood, gone to form niches into the lymphoreticular system, they can ultimately go to any other organ of the body. Okay, so if they go to the CNS, they can cause cranial nerve palsies or seizures or raised ICT. If they go to the GI, that is the gut, they can lead to necrotizing enterocolitis or typhlitis. If they go to bone and joints, in fact, bone and joint involvement, bony pains and arthritis can occur, and there have been cases where a child may primarily present with fever and bone and joint pains and have no other symptoms. Now, in such situations, they can actually be misdiagnosed as juvenile idiopathic arthritis, JIA. So you should take a very thorough history, do a thorough examination, run a CBC, and make sure that when you start immunosuppressants in a JI child, you should do a bone marrow. Many schools of thought say that you should do a bone marrow evaluation before starting immunosuppressive therapy in JI. So by and large, what you should remember is that if a child presents with fever and isolated bone and joint involvement, apart from juvenile idiopathic arthritis, and of course the other commoner diagnosis that you think of, leukemia should also be one of the differentials that you should think of. And then genitourinary manifestations can be as presentation as a testicular mass. In fact, testicular examination is an essential component of examination of any child suspected to have leukemia, because it is going to change the risk stratification, and there can be priapism. So what are the diagnostic investigations that you should do in a child with leukemia? So we have covered what exactly is leukemia, how pathogenesis occurs, then the common clinical manifestations, and now once clinically we are sure that this looks like a leukemia, we should run a certain set of investigations. Now these investigations first of all have to involve the blood. After that you go for bone marrow aspirate and biopsy, and then I'll run you through other sets of investigations which are needed in such. So first of all, in any child with suspect leukemia, you do a CBC. So what can CBC tell you? CBC is complete blood count. So if a child does have leukemia, many a times you may find combination of low HB, low platelet count, and leukocytosis. That is, the TLC will be raised. And within the TLC, if you do a differential leukocyte count, you will find that the lymphocyte count is often abnormally raised. So you'll see that the neutrophils are only 5 to 6%, and the lymphocytes are almost 90 to 95%. However, less commonly, but definitely noted in Indian population, is something known as aleukemic or subleukemic leukemia. So in these children, instead of leukocytosis and lymphocytosis, what you'll see is that the TLC will be extremely low. So that total leukocyte count, normal leukocyte count is between 4,000 to 11,000 per cubic millimeter. In these children, the TLC would be lower than 4,000. So you may find the TLC of 2,500, 1,500. Okay, so this can happen in the subset of aleukemic and subleukemic leukemias. So CBC can give you an idea. Then what is important is a peripheral smear examination. So what will happen in a peripheral smear examination is that apart from confirmation of decreased RBC count and low platelet count, there will be lymphocytosis which can be seen, and importantly, a pathologist will be able to see blasts in the peripheral smear. So if it is not a aleukemic or subleukemic leukemia, in majority of the children with leukemia, the peripheral smear will show blasts. Normally, the peripheral smear, the peripheral blood does not have blasts. Okay, normally the peripheral blood does not have blasts. It happens only in cases of leukemias or as a part of certain infections, but it is not normal. So it should always be evaluated. If a peripheral smear shows blast, a good pathologist will be able to give you a clue whether it is an ALL or an AML. However, there are a set of confirmatory tests which are required to finally tell whether this child has ALL or AML. So a CBC and a peripheral smear. A peripheral smear will show blasts. So what does a peripheral smear show? So look at this slide. This slide is a peripheral smear which is showing, see these ones are RBCs and look at these cells. If you look at them closely, look, the size of a normal lymphocyte is only slightly larger than the RBC. But if you look at this particular cell, it is much larger than the surrounding RBCs. Now look at its nucleus. It is occupying almost the whole of the cell. See this dark purplish colored area. This is the whole of the nucleus. And if you look within this nucleus, the chromatin is very clumped together. Nuclear chromatin is clumped together. This is typical of ALL. Okay. Now, if you look at this particular cell, this is again a peripheral smear. And if it were a live session with you, I would have actually asked you what these are. See, this cell is larger, and if you look at a lymphoblast and compare this one, it is even larger than the lymphoblast. Okay. So this is actually a myeloblast. Look at the nucleus, this purple one. When you compare the NC ratio, over here the nucleus is occupying almost the whole of the cell, whereas over here it is occupying about half of the cell. Now look at the cytoplasm. One, it is granular, and second, if you look at these needle-shaped things, these are the typical OR rods. And OR rods, if present, they are characteristic of a myeloblast, and a myeloblast occurs in AML. Okay, so OR rods are characteristic features of AML. Presence of OR rods tells you that this is AML, but absence of an OR rod does not rule out AML. Then you go to the next set of investigations, that is the bone marrow aspirate and biopsy. So within the bone marrow aspirate, with the bone marrow, you do these 4 investigations. One, you go ahead with a microscopic examination. So just like what you saw in the peripheral smear, you will also examine the bone marrow. Bone marrow normally also has blasts, but when you see that the blast count has risen more than 20%, the number of blasts, when it is more than 20%, that is when you label it as a leukemia. Normally the blast count is less than 5%. Okay. Second is you do cytochemical staining. So cytochemical stains, that is MPO, PAS, Sudan black B and NSE. Then you do immunophenotyping by flow cytometry. This is very important. I'll explain it to you in the next slide. Importantly, immunophenotyping is analogous to what you do as immunohistochemistry in solid tumors. Likewise for liquid blood, you do immunophenotyping. So it is the same thing. When you do it on a liquid tissue, it is known as immunophenotyping. When you do it on a solid tumor, it is known as immunohistochemistry. And lastly, karyotyping and cytogenetics. So you should know this slide very well, okay, because this is the gist of how you diagnose a leukemia. So this is what you do in a morphological examination. In this, look at these. So normal bone marrow will also have blasts, and how will you label it as an acute leukemia blast? Because the number of blasts will be more than 20%. Normally the number of blasts in bone marrow is less than 5%. Now look at this bone marrow slide. Again, it is AML, ALL and AML you will be able to differentiate because of the characteristic of how the blasts appear, and whether it is leukemia or not is defined by the percentage of blasts in the bone marrow. So more than 20% blasts in the bone marrow is diagnostic of leukemia. Now these bone marrow slides itself. So once they've done the microscopic examination, what they'll do is within the bone marrow cuts, they will also stain for these particular stains. So 4 common cytochemical reactions are used: myeloperoxidase, PAS, Sudan black B, and non-specific esterase. So if the cells, the malignant clone is positive for PAS, it is suggestive of ALL. If it is positive for MPO, Sudan black B and NSE, it is suggestive of AML. Now again, MPO is very important. If if a malignant clone is MPO positive, then it is definitely AML. It cannot be ALL. But if it is MPO negative, it can be either ALL or AML. This is something you should remember. Just like OR rods. If OR rods are present, it is definitely AML. If MPO is positive, it is definitely AML. But if it is negative, it can be either. Now, the third thing that you do on the bone marrow aspirate is immunophenotyping. So you collect the bone marrow aspirate in an EDTA tube. Okay, EDTA tube is the same tube in which you collect the blood. So in that particular tube, you collect the bone marrow aspirate. Now, what is the basic principle of immunophenotyping? Whatever cell is there, hematopoietic cell, whether normal or abnormal, whether malignant or normal WBC, on its surface are certain CD markers. CD markers, these are antigens. They are clusters of differentiation. They are antigens. So each cell, whether it is WBC, whether it is T cell, B cell, RBC, platelet, they have a certain set of antibodies present on their surface. It's like a thumbprint. Okay. So in immunophenotyping, we are detecting these thumbprint. You are using certain antibodies to find out what antigens are present on the surface of these cells. Okay. So based on what antigens are present, that is what CD markers are present on these cells, the pathologist can tell whether it is a B cell or it is a T cell or it is a platelet or B cell or T cell, or it can also tell you whether it is malignant or it is normal. So this is the concept of immunophenotyping. Okay. Platelet, RBC and WBC तो machine ही बता देता है, लेकिन whether within the B cells, whether it is B cell or T cell, whether it is malignant or non-malignant, that is decided by immunophenotyping far more confidently. Okay. So monoclonal antibody specific against B and T cell surface antigens are used. So this helps in diagnosis of acute leukemia. It confirms the presence of blast because this immunophenotype is going to be different for blast as compared to normal cells, and it is going to help to differentiate between ALL as well as AML confidently. So this is just an example of what a BALL immunophenotype will be, what a TL immunophenotype, what an AML immunophenotype would be like. So this is what the pathologist will report to you like. In this particular patient's bone marrow aspirate, we found more than 20% blast, and when we did an phenotyping on the blast, they showed these CD markers on this surface. So since these three CD markers were present on the surface, this is going to be BALL. If they find these set of CD markers on the surface, this is going to be TALL. That is how the pathologists report. What is also important for you to know is, you do not rely on, it cannot be that you do not do a morphological examination, you do not do a cytochemical examination, you only do immunophenotyping and label the patient as ALL. No, it has to be, it is always in conjunction that this reporting is done. But in today's day and age, without immunophenotyping, we do not label confidently as ALL or AML. Okay, so it is essential. This particular investigation is essential in all cases of leukemias. Lastly, we have cytogenetics. So within this malignant clone, we find out if particular certain WHO recommended recurrent genetic abnormalities are present, which help in risk stratification. So whether this is standard risk ALL or intermediate risk ALL or high risk ALL, that is defined as per what cytogenetic abnormalities we detect in this malignant clones. So I do not expect you to remember all cytogenetic abnormalities, but there is one that I don't want you to not know, and that is the Philadelphia chromosomal translocation 922. So if the malignant cells of the patients have this translocation 922, it is associated with poor prognosis. Additionally, so they are going to receive high-risk chemotherapy. Additionally, what is important for you to know is, we have a specific drug available against this translocation, which is imatinib. So in the treatment of these children, imatinib is used throughout the course of treatment, and it has significantly improved the survival of these children. So this is the cytogenetic abnormality that I want you guys to remember. Now, apart from these, so amongst investigations, we've done CBC, we have done peripheral smear, which is done from the blood. Then we have done bone marrow investigation, in which you do a microscopic examination. Then you go ahead with karyotype, then you go ahead with cytochemical stains. You thirdly do immunophenotyping, and finally you do cytogenetics. So it's 4 things on the bone marrow. Now the third thing that you need to know is biochemical investigations and ancillary tests. You always do a baseline KFT, LFT serum electrolytes for 2 reasons. One is to know if there is baseline involvement of these organs by the cancerous cells. Secondly, to decide what chemotherapy to give or not to give, because many chemotherapy drugs have both can cause both kidney dysfunction as well as liver dysfunction. So you have to do these KFTs and LFTs for both reasons. Okay. Then uric acid levels are done because leukemia children usually have increased uric acid levels, and you have to monitor for something called tumor lysis syndrome. So you can just remember the name of the syndrome right now, but it is important, especially in case of ALL and AML. Tumor lysis syndrome is one of the complications, and it is monitored with the help of uric acid levels. Then there are certain ancillary tests which you have to do. These include MANTO. Why is MANTO done? It is basically to rule out tuberculosis. So why do we need to rule out tuberculosis? Because if tuberculosis is present, then along with chemotherapy, you have to give anti-tubercular therapy. If you do not do that, then because of the chemotherapy, the child will become immunocompromised, and instead of dying of the cancer or the chemotherapy, he may actually die of the untreated tuberculosis. It may actually flare up. They may be infected, they may not be diseased, right? So likewise, viral markers. Why do you do viral markers in these children? Because you have to know for 2 reasons: hepatitis B and C status and HIV status. HIV, because immunosuppression can lead to manifestation of an of HIV. Okay. Then second is even hepatitis B and C. If a child is infected but undiagnosed till date, and after immunosuppression, it can lead to manifestations of this disease. Secondly, also because many of these children receive blood transfusions. Although in today's times we are having all precautions to prevent blood transfusion, infused HIV, hepatitis B and C, still for medical legal purposes, we need to have a baseline viral marker status. Okay. Lastly, radiological investigations are done in these leukemic children. Why? Because they can have mediastinal lymph nodes. Now, why is it important to know these mediastinal lymph nodes? Because it is going to help in risk stratification of these children. So if they have mediastinal lymphadenopathy, then they will fall into intermediate risk. The risk will be higher. Okay, so they should receive higher chemotherapy. So we need to know. And secondly, it can also lead to complications like compression of the esophagus and trachea. So we should be ready to monitor and manage these complications. So this is why we do a chest X-ray in these children. Now, what are the prognostic factors for ALL? So this is a table again. It's more like a rote learning for you guys, but it has to be done because it is very, very important. Many of these factors are used for risk stratification of these children. Okay, so there are certain favorable and certain unfavorable factors. Now the basis on which these are decided are put in this column. So based on the WBC count, so if it is less than 50,000, it is favorable. If it is more than 50,000, it is unfavorable. Age, any 1 to 10 years is good prognosis. Any extreme of age, less than 1 year or more than 10 years, is poor prognosis. Then females have slightly better prognosis. If the CNS is involved, if the CNS has been infiltrated by the leukemic cells, it is a poorer prognosis. Okay. Type of ALL amongst BLL and TLL, TALL has a poorer prognosis. Okay. BLL has a favorable prognosis, and it is also much commoner than TALL. Okay. Ploidy is something you looked at karyotype. So we told you bone marrow aspirate we have to do 4 things. The 4th thing is karyotyping and cytogenetics. Why? Because karyotyping is going to pick up the ploidy. Ploidy means how many chromosomes you have. So normally a human cell has 46 chromosomes. If the number of chromosomes are more than 46, it is hyperdiploidy. Okay. So hyperdiploidy has a favorable prognosis. If the number of chromosomes is less than 46, it is known as hypodiploidy and it is unfavorable prognosis. Then there are certain genetic markers. So these are usually detected using the FISH technique. Translocation 1221 if present is favorable prognosis. There are a couple of genetic features which present, if present, show unfavorable prognosis. Most important amongst these is translocation 922, which I've already emphasized below before. Okay, so 922 if present is unfavorable prognosis. And lastly, and most importantly, amongst all these factors, the most important prognostic factor for ALL is response to therapy. So when is the response to therapy seen? It is seen at the day 8th of induction. Induction is the phase when you start chemotherapy. So once you start chemotherapy, on day 8 of that, you do a peripheral smear. If the peripheral smear shows blast count less than 1000, it is favorable. If more than 1000, it is unfavorable. And then you do a bone marrow examination at the end of induction and look at the blast count in the bone marrow at that. In that, okay. So if it is less than MRD at the end of induction is less than 10 raised to minus 4, it is favorable. If it is more than that, it is unfavorable. Okay. So these are the prognostic factors which are present in ALL. Now, lastly, the treatment principles for ALL. What are the treatment principles you use? There are 3 forms of therapy. Okay. So first is you give induction. So in induction, what happens is you give a combination of drugs which helps in killing majority of the leukemic cells. So usually a 4-drug combination is used in which steroids play a very important role. Okay. So in that induction, 4 drugs are given together, chemotherapy drugs, and they help in killing majority of the leukemic cells. Usually this induction lasts around 28 to 35 days. That is around a month. Then you have post-induction therapy. So within the post-induction therapy, you have 3 components: consolidation, delayed intensification, and maintenance. What is consolidation? You give chemotherapy to further reduce the leukemic count. What is delayed intensification? You give chemotherapy drugs from different categories, different mechanisms of action, so that leukemic cells which are resistant to one particular chemotherapeutic agent are killed by a different chemotherapeutic agent. So to minimize drug cross resistance, this is done. And lastly, you have maintenance or continuation therapy. This is given for almost a period of 1.5 years so that the remission status is maintained. That is, the leukemia does not relapse at a later date. So we have induction, we have post-induction therapy, and the third is CNS preventive therapy. So you should know that in leukemia, there are certain sanctuary sites where these leukemic cells go. Okay, so these sanctuary sites include the brain. So because of the blood-brain barrier, what happens is that the chemotherapy drugs are not able to reach the brain properly. Okay, so a few leukemic cells can just stay hidden there for a long time and later lead to a leukemic relapse. Once the child has completed therapy, after that, those leukemic cells will start multiplying and lead to relapse. Likewise, testes is also a site, which a sanctuary site because of the testicular blood barrier, which leads to relapse in these areas. Okay, so to cater to the CNS relapse, we give the CNS preventive therapy. So what is CNS preventive therapy? Apart from the chemotherapy which is given into the blood, we usually give chemotherapy agents via an IV cannula into the blood. Apart from that, we give intrathecal methotrexate. That is a chemotherapy drug which is given directly into the lumbar area. Okay, so it is given directly into the spinal fluid. Okay, so spinal fluid that is why that actually helps the chemotherapy agents to cross through the blood-brain barrier and kill any cells which are hiding in this CNS sanctuary site. So these are the principles, treatment principles for ALL. So apart from that, what is important for you to know is that risk stratification is done. So I'm telling you again and again, those prognostic factors that we discussed and the clinical presentation that is present, it helps us to divide ALL patients into standard risk, intermediate risk, and high risk. Why is this stratification needed? What risk are we talking of? The risk is of two things: the risk of death from leukemia and the risk of disease relapse, cancer relapsing after treatment completion. Okay, so those children who are at low risk of death due to leukemia or low risk of cancer relapse are given lesser chemotherapy. Why? Because chemotherapy is a double-edged sword. When you give chemotherapy, you are killing the cancer cells, but you're also causing so many side effects to the patients. There are known cognitive decline, there is known decline in height and weight, there is known many other neurological side effects, cardiac side effects which are present. Okay, so you have to treat a thin line of balance between killing the cancer cells and minimizing the side effects of chemotherapy. That is why risk stratification is done, and it is a basic premise of treating an ALL child. So all the prognostic factors we have discussed, different treatment protocols use a different combinations of these prognostic factors to risk stratify children into standard risk, intermediate risk, and high risk, so that the lower risk children receive lesser chemotherapy, less strong chemotherapy, and the high risk children receive a more strong chemotherapy, so that we decrease the risk of death and relapse of disease, and we minimize the side effects of chemotherapy. The treatment duration of ALL is usually 2 to 2.5 years, and the survival is around 60 to 80%. So the next is just two examples of two protocols, ISICL and INCTR, which are used for these ALL children, and the 10 drugs that are most commonly used are prednisolone. So steroids form an important part. Apart from that, you have anthracyclines like doxorubicin, vincristine, and asparaginase. This you can go back and read from your book. Okay. So that brings us to the end of ALL. So are you guys with me? Are you guys with me? Not dozed off? Not bored? Okay, great, great, great. Even 2 yeses are enough? Yes, great, great. Okay. So see, that's a lot of information I'm giving you. We're actually planning to cover 3 tumors today. So you go back and read today itself, okay? Otherwise you'll get confused, okay? So MDS, beta, one of you have asked whether MDS fits in these schemes of things. We do not, we are just discussing childhood tumors. MDS does not fit into this. Specifically, if a gross difference I have to tell you, in leukemias, there is clonal expansion as well as arrest of maturation. Whereas in myelodysplastic syndromes, there is just an arrest of maturation. Okay, so no, they will not reproduce unabatedly, the hematopoietic precursor cells, but they will fail to mature into fully functional cells. That is what MDS is. Okay, so then we'll go back to the next thing, that is lymphomas. So what is a lymphoma? Lymphoma is a clonal proliferation of lymphocytes. So blood cells, again, RBCs, WBCs, platelets. Okay. Within the WBCs, you have granular lymphocytes and agranular lymphocytes, agranular leukocytes, granular leukocytes and agranular leukocytes. Within the agranular leukocytes, you have monocytes and lymphocytes. And granular leukocytes are neutrophils, eosinophils, and basophils. So where do the lymphomas arise from? From the lymphocytes. Okay. So you understand, from the lymphocytes. So clonal proliferation of lymphocytes leads to lymphoma. So what is the difference between leukemia and lymphoma? Whereas leukemia arises from clonal proliferation of lymphoid and myeloid progenitor in the bone marrow, lymphomas arise from clonal proliferation of just the lymphoid cells. So no myeloid progenitors are not multiplying in lymphomas. So the first difference is that there is clonal proliferation of lymphoid cells, and in the site where this clonal proliferation starts is the lymphoreticular system. So what is the lymphoreticular system? The lymph nodes, the spleen, the thymus, and the Bouldier's ring, which is outside the bone marrow. Okay, so this is the chief difference between leukemia and lymphoma. Ultimately, lymphomas can also go to the stage where they become stage 4 lymphomas, where they ultimately infiltrate the bone marrow. Okay, so at that point, the differentiation becomes very bleak. Okay, so but lymphomas arise from proliferation of lymphoid cells in the lymphoreticular system. Okay, now there are two types of lymphomas: Hodgkin lymphomas, which comprise around 40% of the childhood. Just a minute, 40% of the childhood lymphomas, and they are B cell in origin. Okay, so lymphocytes themselves can be further classified into B cell and T cell. Okay, all Hodgkin's lymphomas are B cell in origin. Okay, then there are non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, which comprise 60% of the childhood lymphomas, and they can be B cell or T cell or NK cell in origin. Okay, so next is the epidemiology. So I have just put comparative slides in the next couple of places so that just you compare and learn about lymphomas. So Hodgkin's lymphoma is commoner in the older age group between 15 to 19 years, whereas non-Hodgkin's lymphoma is commoner in 5 to 15 years of age. Both Hodgkin's and non-Hodgkin's lymphomas are commoner in males as compared to females. And in fact, one thing you should know about non-Hodgkin's lymphoma is that up to 70% of the non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, that is 3/4 of the children present with advanced disease stage at diagnosis. So there are 4 stages of both Hodgkin's and non-Hodgkin's, and almost 70% of children with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, they come to a doctor, present to us when they're already in stage 3 and 4, because the symptoms in the initial stages are very non-specific, and probably the parents do not seek help for that. Okay, and in children, not in adults, in children, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma is far more aggressive a tumor as compared to Hodgkin's lymphoma. Hodgkin's lymphoma has a very good prognosis in children, whereas non-Hodgkin's lymphoma is a very aggressive tumor in children. Okay. Now, what are the risk factors that you have? The risk factors, all these 6 risk factors are true for both Hodgkin's and non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, but the ones I've placed on the side of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma are the commoner ones for this particular tumor, and the ones I've placed on the left side are commoner for Hodgkin's lymphoma. Okay, so family history. A family history of Hodgkin's lymphoma can lead to higher risk in the children for Hodgkin's lymphoma. Then you have certain infections, especially with Epstein-Barr virus, which predisposes to Hodgkin's lymphoma. Then you have certain autoimmune conditions like SLE and sarcoidosis, which is a risk factor. Then you have immunosuppressed conditions. So either a congenital immunodeficiency like X-linked A gamma globulinemia, which leads to increased risk of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, or post-transplant immunosuppression. So many patients who have received a transplant, for example, kidney transplant, or for that matter, bone marrow transplant, they are consistently receiving immunosuppression. So those who are in post-transplant immunosuppression are also at increased risk of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. And finally, you have radiation. So all these things are risk factors for lymphoma. So family history, infections, autoimmune diseases, immunosuppression, and radiation. Okay. Now, what is the pathological classification of lymphoma? Hodgkin's lymphoma can be chiefly divided into classical Hodgkin's lymphoma, and then you have nodular lymphocyte predominant Hodgkin's lymphoma. So 95% of the children have classical Hodgkin's lymphoma. Within that classical Hodgkin's lymphoma, you have 4 varieties. So these classifications, mostly the pathologist will tell you. However, what is important to notice, these classifications do not really change any treatment for the children. Whatever morphology, pathology they have, they are treated similarly. Okay, so this can be nodular sclerosis, mixed cellular lymphocyte which are lymphocyte depleted. Then you have non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. Within non-Hodgkin lymphoma, there are 4 important subtypes which are categorized. There are many more, but the most important ones I've told you. Burkitt's and Burkitt's-like lymphoma, this is one of the most aggressive ones. In non-endemic areas, usually presents with an abdominal mass. In endemic areas like Africa, mostly present as a jaw mass. So it is present in 50% of the children with non-Hodgkin's have Burkitt's. Then you have diffuse large B-cell lymphoma, which is present in 20%. Again, it is aggressive. Then you have anaplastic large cell lymphoma. So this is one of the more indolent forms, so slow growing form of lymphomas, which usually will present with skin lesions. Okay, so it can present with skin lesions, and it can present with abnormal, unexpected site involvement like bony involvement. Okay, and then you have lymphoblastic lymphoma. This is again very aggressive, and this particular subtype of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma is actually treated like acute leukemia. The rest of the non-Hodgkin's lymphoma are treated on a separate protocol, whereas lymphoblastic lymphoma is treated like a leukemia. So next, when you look at the slide of a classical Hodgkin's lymphoma, this is a slide, and can you see this particular cell? This is a Reed-Sternberg cell. So it just looks like an owl's eye. So what is it? This particular cell, if present, it is pathognomonic of Hodgkin's lymphoma. So it is a large cell. When you look at the rest of the tumor cells, they are small. Now this particular Reed-Sternberg cell is a large cell, almost 2 to 6 times that of an RBC, bilobed nucleus. So it has a bilobe. This whole thing is a nucleus, and you have bilobed nucleus and two large nucleoli. So within the nucleus, there are two nucleoli. It just looks like an owl's eye. And this Reed-Sternberg cell arises from the germinal center B cell. Okay, so rest of these cells are lymphocytes, eosinophils, and fibrosis. So this is pathognomonic of Hodgkin's lymphoma. You remember, in a Hodgkin's lymphoma, majority of the mass, which is usually leads to lymphadenopathy. Okay, so the tumor cells are very small in number. If you look at the tumor cells, this is a tumor cell, this is a tumor cell. In between all these cells are just lymphocytes, eosinophils, and fibrosis. That is why when you make a diagnosis of Hodgkin's lymphoma, which is by biopsy, you do not take an FNAC. You have to do an entire excisional lymph node biopsy, because the number of tumor cells are very few. If you just do an FNAC, you may miss the tumor cells. Okay, so it has to be an excision biopsy, which is then, excision biopsy is taking out the entire lymph node as a whole. Okay, and it is then sliced by the pathologist, and it is viewed under the microscope as sheets. Okay, so then the chances of diagnosing and picking up tumor cells is far more. Okay, so that is also something I'll be talking on later. Hodgkin's diagnosis is by an excision lymph node biopsy. Now, if you look at the pathology of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, you characteristically talk of the starry sky appearance. Okay, so when you look at over here, it is very aggressive. Contrary to Hodgkin's, neither tumor cells will occupy the whole of the area. Okay, so whole of the lymph node is replaced by these blue tumor cells. And what are the starry areas? These are white areas, which are actually macrophages. So why have these macrophages turned white? It is because during the processing itself, this area, it has a lot of fat, so it is just removed. It does not take up the stain at all. So this appears as white. Okay, so this is the classical starry sky pattern in non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. So Reed-Sternberg cell in Hodgkin's and starry sky pattern in non-Hodgkin's. So clinical features, lymphadenopathy. Now there are so many groups of lymph nodes, so just be sure that you examine all of them, whether it is cervical, axillary, if you have inguinal, you have femoral, you have popliteal, infraclavicular. Okay, then you have epitrochlear. Do not forget all these lymph nodes. There are a certain set of lymph nodes which you will not be able to examine, like mediastinal and paraaortic, but there are so many which you will be able to examine. You should make it a point that you examine all of them. So this is cervical lymphadenopathy in this first picture. Look at this particular lymph node. This is a supraclavicular lymph node. So if you don't pay attention, you're going to miss this. Then you have axillary lymphadenopathy and you have inguinal lymphadenopathy. Also note that you usually use a cutoff of 1 centimeter for cervical nodes, 1 centimeter for axillary, and 1.5 centimeters for inguinal lymph nodes. Okay. And what is the characteristic of these lymph nodes? They will be painless. So there will be no pain. That is characteristic. Okay. They will be firm. There's an you will have fluctuation. If there's an abscess or pus, it will fluctuate, and they're rubbery in consistency. This is characteristic of Hodgkin's. Okay. Then in lymphomas, you can have an abdominal mass. So if you talk of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, typically look at the abdomen of the child, just grossly distended. There's an intra-abdominal mass, and you can also see an umbilical herniation. hepatosplenomegaly can be present. Now, if you look at this particular child, look at what mass he has. He has a jaw mass. So this typically happens in an endemic Burkitt's lymphoma, and because of that mass, it can lead to obstruction of the nose, or parotid enlargement and tonsillar enlargement can be present. Then other features can be skin involvement. So I told you typically skin involvement is present in anaplastic large cell lymphoma. So a lot of itching, or simply even without the skin lesions, itching may be present. And there can be other features. If bone marrow infiltration is present, then again features of anemia, recurrent infections and bleeds can happen, and non-specific symptoms like fever and weight loss can happen. Okay. So then you have this differentiation between Hodgkin's and non-Hodgkin's. So in Hodgkin's lymphoma, peripheral lymphadenopathy is commoner. So the lymph nodes which are palpable, like cervical lymph node, axillary lymph node, and inguinal lymph nodes, these are peripheral lymph nodes. These are the ones which are commonly enlarged. Whereas in non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, the site of presentation in non-endemic areas is an abdominal mass. In endemic areas, usually a jaw involvement. In Hodgkin's lymphoma, there is contiguous involvement of lymph nodes. That means if it starts from one cervical lymph node, it will then migrate to involve the contiguous lymph node. So it will go from this upper cervical to lower cervical. Then it is going to go to your this thing, mediastinal, pretracheal, paratracheal, mediastinal, and axillary. So it is going to have a contiguous involvement of the lymph nodes. ऐसा नहीं होगा कि एक cervical है, एक inguinal है. That's far less common. Okay, so it will be contiguous involvement of lymph nodes. Whereas in non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, mostly visceral lymph nodes are involved. So intra-abdominal lymph nodes, and in fact extranodal involvement. Outside of the lymph nodes, other organs are also involved. Like we just said, jaw involvement, tonsillar involvement, GIT involvement, that is present. Whereas in Hodgkin's, primarily lymph nodes are involved. In Hodgkin's lymphoma, you have something called B symptoms. Okay, B symptoms is associated with poorer prognosis. So what are those 3 B symptoms? Fever, drenching night sweats, and weight loss of more than 10% over a period of 6 months. Okay, so these are features. If any one of them is present, we say that the B symptoms are present in a Hodgkin's child, and we label it as poorer prognosis. And whenever we classify something as poor prognosis, good prognosis, we usually have a more intense chemotherapy for them. This Hodgkin's in general is less aggressive as compared to non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. So non-Hodgkin's survival is far less in our Indian children as compared to Hodgkin's lymphoma. Then you talk of investigations. First, I'll talk of investigations which are common between both Hodgkin's and non-Hodgkin's. So the ones which I've highlighted in red. Diagnostic for both is a biopsy. So in Hodgkin's, you have to do an excision lymph node biopsy because I've already explained the tumor cells are few. Within FNAC, you may miss the tumor cells. So an excision lymph node biopsy is done. Whereas in non-Hodgkin's, you can do an FNAC and lymph node, or FNAC or lymph node biopsy, which need not be excisional. Okay, a part of the through-cut biopsy will also do. But importantly, immunohistochemistry is done. So this is just like what we told, flow cytometry, immunophenotyping in leukemia, likewise immunohistochemistry in lymphoma. So this is going to give them diagnosis of thumbprint diagnosis. Okay, so it is going to tell them whether Hodgkin's or non-Hodgkin's. Then the other red ones, which we say the laboratory and pre-chemotherapy, the rationale for doing these tests is exactly what I explained to you for leukemia. So KFT, LFT, because we need a baseline liver function, kidney function, that whether they are involved with tumor cells, and if we need to avoid certain chemotherapeutic agents which may lead to kidney damage or liver damage. Likewise, viral markers and MAN2 to rule out HIV, hepatitis B, hepatitis C, and TB. And if any of these are present in that child, then you start treatment for that particular disease concomitantly. Okay. Finally, the set of investigations that we use for staging. These include certain definitive investigations like CT, neck, chest, and abdo, bone marrow, aspirate and biopsy, and CSF. So it mainly consists of these 3 things: CT scan, bone marrow, aspirate, biopsy, and CSF. So in Hodgkin, this you have to do in both Hodgkin's and non-Hodgkin's because you have to do the staging. So for that staging, you need what all lymph nodes in the bodies are positive, are involved. because this will also help you to in two ways. One, you're going to decide how long the chemotherapy has to be given. Secondly, it is also help you to monitor the response to therapy. So sequentially, you're going to do CT scans later to see if the child is responding to a particular chemotherapy. Again, bone marrow aspirate and biopsy is done for staging, and CSF is also done for staging whether CNS involvement is present or not. The specifications have mentioned that for non-Hodgkin's, bone marrow aspirate and CSF is done in all cases. For Hodgkin's, BMA and BMD is done if stage is more than 2B on CT scan, and CSF is done only in cases with CNS symptoms. Okay. So a lot of information, just soak in the slide, go back and read it. It will be clearer. I'm here to solve your doubts. Yeah. So, okay, the next two slides are about staging for Hodgkin's and non-Hodgkin's. Staging for Hodgkin's is known as Ann Arbor staging. So this line is through the diaphragm. Okay. So stage 1 is a localized disease on single side of the diaphragm. Okay, single lymph nodal involvement on single side of the diaphragm. Stage 2 is 2 or more lymph node groups are involved on the same side of that. Stage 3 is 2 or more lymph node groups are involved, but on opposing sides of the diaphragm. Okay. And stage 4 is metastatic disease. So apart from the lymph nodes, bone marrow, liver, spleen, and multiple other organs may be involved. Okay, so this is simple. Now then you have stage 2 staging for NHL. It is very similar. What is additional in this is within stage 2, you also have a primary GIT tumor. So if there is a GIT tumor which is grossly resectable, it will be included in stage 2. And there are certain criteria. So this again, I think there's, instead of, presenting to you over here, you can go back and read. Primary GIT tumor which is not grossly resectable will be in stage 3. And paraspinal epidural tumor will again directly qualify as stage 3. So these factors are present, they directly qualify as stage 2 and stage 3. Barring that, the staging is almost identical to what you're seeing in Hodgkin's lymphoma for Ann Arbor staging. Okay, so Ann Arbor staging for Hodgkin's lymphoma, stage 2 staging for NHL. If you do not remember these factors, at least that simplified classification you can state. Okay, what I've just told you before. Now, as far as treatment of Hodgkin's and non-Hodgkin's is concerned, the mainstay of treatment is chemotherapy. So, जब भी आप कैंसर ट्रीट करते हैं 3 modalities होती हैं आपके पास. Chemotherapy मतलब you're giving drugs either intravenously into the blood or you're giving oral chemotherapy drugs. There is radiotherapy where you're giving radiation to the tumor site, and there is surgery where you are just taking out the tumor. Okay. So in leukemia as well as Hodgkin's and non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, the mainstay of treatment is chemotherapy and chemotherapy. Okay. For Hodgkin's lymphoma, duration of treatment is 4 to 6 months, depending on the stage. So stage 1 and 2, usually 4 months. Stage 3 and 4, 6 months. Okay. Treatment of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, depending on the stage and the type of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, it can be 6 to 24 months. Then this is an example of the common chemotherapy regimens that are used. So ABVD for Hodgkin's you can remember, and BFM for non-Hodgkin's you can remember. Indication for radiotherapy are very few. So in case of Hodgkin's lymphoma, if there is bulky disease means the bulk of the tumor is more than 10 centimeter in the longer direction. That the radiologist will tell you when he does the CT scan. In that situation, after chemotherapy completion, you give radiotherapy at the tumor site. That is that. There is no other indication for radiotherapy. In cases of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, there's just one indication, that is if it is a lymphoblastic lymphoma with CNS involvement. In that situation, CNS radiotherapy is given. Okay. This I've told you again and again. Prognosis in Hodgkin's lymphoma is good. With more than 95% survival. And prognosis in non-Hodgkin's lymphoma is poorer as compared to Hodgkin's, but overall survival in places has been reported to 70 to 90% depending on the type and stage of disease. Although in the Indian scenario, we find the survival is up to the tune of 60 to 70%. So that brings us to the end of lymphomas, and the last tumor for the day is Wilms tumor. Are you still there with me? Not sleepy? Please wake up if you have gone to sleep already. Hi, some replies in the chat box. A few of you there. The last part of the class? Yeah. Okay. Yes, yes, yes. Great, great. So this won't take more than 7-8 minutes. Yes, great. But do go back and read. That's lots of information. I'm sure it's tough to take in that much, but go back and read. So the last part of it is Wilms tumor. Okay, so we've jumped to kidney tumors. Okay, and amongst the kidney tumors, which are around 5% of the childhood tumors, Wilms tumor is the commonest. Almost 90% of kidney tumors in children are going to be Wilms tumor. Okay, and Wilms tumor is also known as nephroblastoma. So epidemiology, peak incidence is 2 to 3 years of age. छोटे बच्चों में होता है, ठीक है? So genetic alterations, like leukemia में we said that less than 5% में आपको risk factors मिलते हैं, लेकिन Wilms tumor में genetic alterations are important. Whenever we talk of Wilms tumor, we will always think of इसको underlying genetic alterations क्या present है. Okay, so amongst these 3 are important. Wilms tumor 1, so this gene has been named WT1 gene loss. So it's a tumor suppressor gene. Okay? So WT1 is a tumor suppressor gene which is present on chromosome 11. So अगर कोई भी tumor suppressor gene आपका loss हो जाता है, there will be a risk of increased risk of tumor. So Wilms tumor gene loss, then WNT pathway activation, and IGF2 overexpression. These are the 3 genetic alterations you to see in Wilms tumor. Okay, so what are the risk factors? In 10% of the children with Wilms tumor, you are able to identify genetic syndromes. So I'll just move you through the commonest ones. These are the Dennis-Drash syndrome, the Vagar syndrome, and Beckwith-Wiedemann syndrome. So, and the second part can be familial. So there is a family history of tumor. So if there are 1% in the family has Wilms tumor, there is 1 to 2% risk that other members of the family may have this tumor. So familial 1 to 2% of Wilms tumor is identified to be familial. 10% of cases of Wilms tumor have an identifiable underlying genetic syndrome. It is a large proportion. Okay. So this is the Dennis-Drash syndrome. So in this particular CT scan image, which is a cross-sectional view, you look at these kidneys. This is the right kidney, this is the left kidney, and you see a tumorous growth over there. Okay, this yellow arrow. So this is Wilms tumor. Then you have male pseudo-homophroditism. That means that the karyotype अंदर से बच्चा is a male, XY है, but the phenotype is of a female. And the third component of it is diffuse mesangial sclerosis, which often presents as a steroid-resistant nephrotic syndrome. So male pseudo-homophroditism, that is बाहर से बच्चा लेके आएगी, मदर बोलेगी ये तो लड़की है मेरी, उसको steroid resistant nephrotic syndrome होगा, karyotype कराओगे तो XY आएगा, and उसको Wilms tumor. So this is the Dennis-Drash syndrome. Okay. Then you have the Vagar syndrome, which occurs because of WT1 deletion. Okay. So Wilms tumor is one component. A से क्या है? Aniridia. ठीक है? So iris is absent. यहाँ देखो iris ही नहीं है. ठीक है? Then G से क्या है आपका? Genitourinary abnormalities. So whether the ureter is duplicate ureter is present or the horseshoe shaped kidney is present, that can happen. ठीक है? Or you may have hypospadias in such children. ठीक है? And the last component R से क्या है? Mental retardation. So retardation is present in these children. ठीक है? Although mental retardation now is no longer used, we use the term intellectual disability. But Vagar syndrome में mnemonic जो बना रखा है लोगों ने, acronym जो बना रखा है, R stands for retardation. Then you have the Beckwith-Wiedemann syndrome. तो इसमें hemi hypertrophy हो जाता है, ठीक है? Named after these two scientists, Beckwith and Wiedemann. इसमें क्या होता है? Hemi hypertrophy होगा. तो आप ये वाली CT scan image देखो, इसका जो left side है, again it's a cross sectional view. ये वाली किडनी देखो कितनी छोटी है और ये कितनी बड़ी है, ठीक है? So the left side has completely hemi hypertrophy. ये पूरा area ही अलग लग रहा है ना? And then you have macroglossia. So the tongue is protruding out of the mouth. Then you look at the ears, there are earlobe crease. So normally आपके earlobe पे creases नहीं होते, इन बच्चों में earlobe पे crease दिखेगा. Then you have microcephaly and they can have umbilical hernia. So these are components of Beckwith-Wiedemann syndrome. So Dennis Trash, Buger and Beckwith-Wiedemann syndrome can be associated with Wilms tumor. Okay. So what do you see when you do a pathological evaluation? You see that it is made up of combination of blastemal, epithelial and stromal cells. So इसमें small round blue cells. So आप बोलते हो ना small round blue cell tumor, उसमें neuroblastoma एक common आता है. One differential is Wilms tumor जिसके अंदर blastemal component ज़्यादा हो. ठीक है? So blastemal component, they are small round blue cells. अगर किसी Wilms tumor में blastemal component ज़्यादा है, that means that it is a more aggressive tumor, but also it is going to be more chemosensitive. Okay. Then you have clinical features. Just a minute. Then you have clinical features. It is actually 5 minutes if she's incident. So asymptomatic abdominal mass can be present. So this is the most common presentation of Wilms tumor. They just have an asymptomatic mass. Then they have hypertension in 25% of the children. Abdominal pain can be present in 30% of the children. Hematuria in 10 to 25%. Fever in 20%. And anorexia and vomiting. So kidney involved है, इसीलिए आपका abdominal mass देखिएगा, which is common. Mother might be bathing the child and suddenly they feel that there is a mass. So they may come to you with an abdominal mass. Hypertension is something which you usually recognize during the evaluation. So it is present in 25%. Abdominal pain may be present in 30% of the children. They may come up with complaint of blood in urine. So hematuria करके आ जाते हैं, and some may just present with fever. And then on examination, you may palpate an abdominal mass, and on evaluation, you may find a Wilms tumor. Complications, it can lead to anemia, because whenever a tumor is present in the kidney, kidney is the site which produces erythropoietin. So it can lead to EPO suppression. Then it can also, because of it can also lead to thrombocytosis. They can be acquired deficiency of von Willebrand factor and factor 7. Polycythemia can also be present. Anemia and polycythemia can both be presentations, although anemia is far commoner as compared to polycythemia. So what happens is that because of EPO deficiency, because of some certain factors, thrombopoietin excess is produced in the body. Because of the TPO excess, thrombocytosis occur, and TPO also leads to increased production of RBC. Sometimes they present with polycythemia. The most common site of distant metastasis is the lung. So आपको lungs के अंदर शायद most of the solid tumors, the most common site of metastasis is the lung, except for neuroblastoma. Okay. So respiratory distress can therefore be manifestation, and other sites can be liver. Also, Wilms tumor is the one which can actually have a contiguous spread of the tumor and lead to IVC thrombosis. So it can spread from the kidney into the renal vein and from the renal vein into the inferior vena cava. The investigations, there some surgeons prefer that they just diagnose and label Wilms tumor on radiology itself. So abdominal ultrasound as a screening that what is the origin of this tumor, whether it is from the adrenal gland or it is from the kidney, and also to see the spread. Otherwise, a good radiologist with a good CT scan can actually confidently say that this is a Wilms tumor and can tell the extent of spread. So CT scan is an essential feature to diagnose Wilms tumor. So a claw sign is usually present because of the tumor grows. It just compresses the normal kidney, and the rest of the kidney tissue forms a claw around that tumor mass. So that is known as the claw sign. Then there can be chest X-ray where pulmonary metastasis can be detected, and FNEC is something depends on where the child is receiving treatment. So some schools of thought say that you do an FNEC before you start treatment for the child. So this helps in psychological confirmation of the tumor prior to chemotherapy. Other schools of thought say that radiology is good enough to diagnose a Wilms tumor, because if you do an FNAC, you're going to spill the tumor in the tract and lead to upstaging. But जो FNAC पहले करते हैं वो कहते हैं कि it can still be some other tumor. You cannot be so sure on radiology. We should do an FNAC first and confirm the tumor. So this is the staging. I just want you to go back and read the staging for yourself. As far as treatment is concerned, surgery and chemotherapy form the mainstay of treatment. So इसमें chemotherapy के अंदर surgery plays an important role. Radiotherapy has a very limited role. So two protocols are followed. One is the COG, which says that you just diagnose it with a CT scan. You do an upfront surgical resection, and then you give chemotherapy. Whereas the PSYOP group says that you first do an FNAC, give a preoperative chemotherapy, and then you do a surgery. So the treatment depends on the stage. Stage 1 and 2, you do surgery with chemotherapy. Stage 3, again surgery and chemotherapy, but for a longer duration. Stage 4 will entail surgery, chemo, and radiotherapy for pulmonary metastasis. The prognosis is very good for Wilms tumor, more than 90% survive. Yeah, that brings us to the end of the lecture. Thank you all. I think you need to log in for the next lecture. So I think I'll just end at this note, and you can just attend your next lecture. Thank you. Go back and read Ghai at least. Go back and read Ghai. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.